So the last part of what I wanted to talk to you about was originally John had asked for cost controls, but I want to talk more about cost management. Cost controls, I think, are part of that. How I wanted to kind of split up the lecture was just to talk a bit about cost management, just what it is. I want to talk about the Scottish Parliament building. It's kind of maybe a case study, short case study of cost management. I want to talk about our contractual obligations as architects to the budget that we agree to. So we agree to it when we sign our agreement with our client. And I wanted to sort of look at some cost management tools, which are relatively straightforward. Oftentimes involve outside consultants, but oftentimes also involve our approach to the project. So cost management is really, it's applied at the earliest stages of the job. Project planning, it allows design concepts to be fully evaluated and realistic budgets to be established. Cost management avoids the delays and conflicts that arise when concept issues need to be revisited later in the design process. And I just wanted to use that as a definition for the lecture. I was at a briefing session last week in Ottawa for the new Science and Tech Museum. It was a public briefing, so and that museum, there was about 60 architects there. The area of the new museum is 535. It's a collection storage facility. They're going to bring collections from 3 different warehouses and locate them into one building. And the building size was 535,000 square feet. And the building budget, so there was just a 2 or 3 page brief. And the building budget was $117 million. And there were 60 architects there to kind of get more information. For our engineers and architects, there's a big expression of interest, an RFP submission at the end of this month, where you have to create teams, you have to kind of answer this kind of length of questions about who's going to do what in the process, you have to develop schedules, you have to develop a methodology. In terms of doing this project, they're asking for a schedule to, from start to finish, 27 months, which is like really fast for a project that size. So, and this really comes back to management. So we were standing in the briefing session. Typically, when you get something like that, you take 535,000, look at the 117 million, and you quickly arrive at a price per square meter or cost, per square foot. And so, for example, museums might go for anywhere from $200 to over $1,000 a square foot depending, and that includes archives, which is essentially what this is. But this building has a lot of labs. I think there's 20% of this 535,000 is lab space. And so we were just standing there looking at this 535,000 square feet, and in the fine print they said, this is the kind of net area of the building, which includes the circulation space, say, in a laboratory. It includes the circulation space in the storage area. But it doesn't include walls, general public circulation, mechanical spaces, electrical spaces. So then everybody goes, okay, well then, what is the gross up to your gross area? And this all comes to cost management, right from the beginning of the gate. So with a gross up at a minimum for storage like that, it's all of a sudden 1.4. So you're looking at close to 750,000 square feet for $117 million. So the budget's just collapsed. And the majority, a significant portion of that budget will go to museums, which are going to represent about the sort of labs, which will take up quite a bit of that. So this is all standing there in this briefing session, making these calculations, and come to the conclusion the budget's too low. It has to be too low, because almost like your budget is like $150 a square foot, and it includes systems to store all the collections, lab systems, backup systems, extra circulation spaces for those things. So, so we wonder, is that done intentionally? Like, is that done intentionally to designers? Is that to get us to keep our fees down? To not make that kind of connection to the fact that it was a net space? not quite a net space, but almost a net space. And these are the things that apply to cost management. Because if they don't get those numbers right, the job will go very wrong. People will make a lot of assumptions about their fees. There'll be a lot of assumptions about being able to do work. They won't have the money to provide for the resources. They won't have the ability to actually complete the job in the time that they have. So this, to me, is the start of cost management, when you actually receive the briefing from your client or your supposed client. So oftentimes a client will come and say, I've got this much money to spend. I've got a house, I've got like $2 million or $3 million or $4 million to spend. So then you have, I mean, obviously many of you maybe have done this already, I'm sure John, Tom, so you have to parse out, like, what does that mean in the budget? How much is actually in there for construction? How much is in there for furniture? How much is in there for fees and permits and all of that? And then all of a sudden, oftentimes the budget either collapses quite dramatically. And it's very, very rare that a client would have taken that money out and set aside a percentage to cover all of that. So that to me is the start of cost management. That to me is the beginning of our relationship with somebody as we advise them about how to think about the money that they're going to spend. So, so when I was working on the Canadian War Museum, it was around 2000. We were, it was a couple of years, 2005, 2004. There was this project that was happening in Scotland. It was the Scottish Parliament building, and while we were working on the museum, there was public servants that were kind of our clients. Some of them were going to Scotland. There was this inquiry that was underway called the Hollywood Inquiry about this project. And this is a really interesting project. So I didn't think much about it at the time. It didn't really have much to do with us. But I had a chance to kind of read more about it recently in the last few years, just to kind of understand more about what was really special about this project, why there was an inquiry. A lot of it had to do with cost management, a lot of it had to do with pre-planning, a lot of it had to do with expectations, and a lot of it had to do with knowledge and skill. So I thought maybe I would use this as a bit of a kind of case study, a small case study of a project that started out with the best intentions, the very best of intentions, to celebrate a very significant time in Scotland's history when they were beginning to sort of evolve away from Britain's control of their political system. And I think they just had this. Did they just have this referendum recently to completely be independent of Britain? I think it was last year, which they narrowly lost. But this new Parliament building by Morales and RMJM has won quite a few awards. I just thought I'd list some of them. Centenary Medal, Royal Institute, the Sterling Prize, the Civic Trust Award. But the genesis of the building really started, the genesis of this building really started in the Act of Union in 1707, at least when I was looking at it. And that's when Scotland had an independent parliament, Britain had an independent parliament. Britain basically, in a short form, I guess they conquered Scotland and they said we're going to have one parliament. So they dissolved the Scottish Parliament and they created the Union of 1707. All the politicians moved to Westminster, and that's where they were for 300 years. And then in 1997, there was a Scottish referendum for the creation of a Scottish Parliament. And it would be a bit where they decided that they were going to devolve a series of powers to Scotland. And Scotland would be able to tax, would be able to enact laws, and Britain would go after military and a series of other things. So they had this Scottish devolution referendum in 1997, and for the creation of the Scottish Parliament. So there was, when this was created, this was done by a government. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister. This gentleman here became the First Minister of Scotland, Donald Ward, who also became quite a significant individual in the creation of the new Scottish Parliament building. Quite a significant player. And he was a member of the Scottish National Party. So he became a driver behind the referendum, and then became a driver behind the creation of this new building. So the new building needed a home. They needed somebody to design it, and you needed somebody to kind of speak to and reflect what Scotland was and what they wanted it to be. So they issued out an expression of interest. There were 70 firms that submitted, expression of interest. 12 firms were shortlisted and interviewed for the first round. There's a good list of firms here: Danish, Michael Wolford, he was with James Sterling, Combe Patterson, they were part of the Community Museum submission. Benson, Forsyth, Raphael Manoli, Meyer, Morales, Denton Corker from Australia. So it was a really interesting group. Parallel to this, there were other kind of public institutions being built. I think Wales was building a new parliament gate, also being devolved, and Berlin was also renovating and restoring the Reichstag. I think that might have been soon after, but it was all around this time. 5 firms kind of were selected out of the 12 that came to be interviewed. Raphael Manoli, Denton Corker, Michael Wolford, Morales, and Richard Myers. And there were 4 sites. There were 4 sites for the competition. Decided the competition was the best way to proceed to do it. They used the European Commission rules for the competition. So the intention was that they weren't going to select the design, they were going to select the designer. That was the intent of the competition. So there were 4 sites. 2 sites were based around renovations. This was the Royal High School, I think it was Royal High School, and this was the old Parliament buildings, which were now the Supreme Courts. This was an area here in Haymarket, which I think was an area that didn't play big. And then at the very last minute, this site was added in, which was near Hollywood Park. Beautiful site. It was an old brewery, which made it was a long time. It's a big brewery that had fallen on hard times, and they were moving to another part of Scotland. And this came up at the very last minute, so this was added to the competition. And so there's the Royal High School. This they had actually started to renovate in Scottish Parliament. The minute after it was the devolution was referendum, Scottish Parliament met here temporarily. So they poured a bunch of money in here. These were the old Parliament buildings, which were the Scottish Supreme Court. So the Haymarket, and this was Hollywood. Holyrood Road was the site selected for the Scottish Parliament site. It became the location for the design competition. So 2 firms of the 5 had the most, so they went through a process of coming to give presentations, and then they put it out for public voting, and 2 firms had the most public votes, Morales and Manoli. And Manoli slightly exceeded Morales. And so I thought I just thought I would show Morales' submission. There were like 6 boards that they had to submit. Here's hidden model here. This is the Hollywood site. That's Hollywood Park. There, that's where the brewery was stood. The desire for the parliamentary debating chambers themselves, they wanted it to be the European Union style, not the parliamentary style that they have in England, where they have the 2 sides sitting facing each other. They wanted to have the sides sitting side by side. So that became a key part of this kind of new Parliament building. And then, of course, they had the parliamentary offices and the support systems for that. So Manoli's, I think there was 35 or 40,000 people that visited. They traveled these exhibitions throughout Scotland, and they received public votes. These are some of his kind of drawings. I didn't include all the drawings, there's like 6, but I showed a few here. You can sort of get a sense of what it is. Obviously, the big piece was the chambers, debating chambers. It was actually a beautiful park. It wasn't like in the city of Edinburgh. It was on the edge of this beautiful green space. Edge of the park. There's 2 mountains. There's kind of 2 mountain sort of ranges, and there was one of the ranges that was kind of framing at the edge of the park. So it was really a picturesque, beautiful kind of rural setting, actually, right in the heart of Edinburgh. This was Morales' submission, which was really, I think it was kind of a really brilliant submission, as it really talked about the site, talked about how the site was really had to express not the city as much as it had to express the meaning of Scotland at this kind of new stage of their life, the new stage of their political life, as they were kind of coming into their own once again. It had to, things like it had to be a broader thought. It should come out in a clear, strong statement in a way independent of site circumstances. Any strong statement should carry political implications. The Parliament is a form of people's mind. It is a mental place. The building should be built out of land, carved into land, form of gallery. So this became their submission. And it just became a series of thoughts about what could possibly be achieved, as opposed to, say, Benelli's approach. And then there was some kind of early kind of conceptual thoughts about it. And these were some of the final images. There was a model that was created. I think this was inspired by kind of overturned boats along the Scottish shores or something. I think he had some images here. Oh, here. Some of these. Here. And so the two architects had very different approaches. They brought them back for another round of interviews. And then the chairman of this committee was Donald Duke, who was also the first minister of Scotland. There weren't that many professionals, like there weren't that many architects. There were like some well-known, there were some like local architects that were on there, a lot of government architects that were on there. But Dewar really drove the selection of Morales as the individual that should actually design the project. So the project started. The project had a very, very tight timeline. They wanted to get the project completed before the next government came in the UK, because they were very concerned that the UK, if it was a different party that came into power, would change the devolution results and try and pull back some of the powers that had been granted to Scotland. So there was a real pressure to get this building created, designed, documented, and built sort of within a political frame of like 4 years. It was a very, very big event. And so I thought I became intrigued by this because I started to look at sort of how they started to think about the numbers that they were going to apply to this program. So the first cost projection, and coming back to the cost management, we're only going to talk about cost management. We're not going to talk about much else. But the first cost projection, the estimate, the very first one they didn't take into account the location or design of any new building. So they just had created a number. A bit like the science and tech. They almost like created a number. There was no site. They selected the site late in the game, and this was the number that was given to Morales to begin the process. So I took the numbers. I kind of checked, the numbers. I put these are Canadian dollars. They were in pounds originally. They're back in the 90s, so I applied the inflation rate. I applied the exchange. So this was the original number. It's not bad. It's $135 million Canadian. I mean, that's for Parliament, but I'm feeling it's probably not quite there. There's no kind of they had a very cursory program that they could use to kind of design it that hadn't really been thought through in terms of spaces and requirements. Morales was anyway. In this diagram, they were tearing down the brewery and clearing the site. Morales was selected. They adjusted the price to $180 million. They revised the estimates upwards as the initial projection was based on a cleared site on a brownfield land. So obviously, they're not sure actually who did the original estimates, but obviously the original estimates they realized quickly weren't sufficient enough for them to do the project. And this all comes back to the initial conceptual thinking of cost management. So this figure didn't include that, or so value-added taxes or site acquisition costs. So it didn't include actually the cost of acquiring land. So anyway, this is 1998. 1999, they had to, and Donald came back. They had to provide a new round of cost estimates and jump to $346 million. This took into account the consultant fees, which haven't been taken into account, site costs, which again haven't been taken into account, demolition, value-added taxes, archaeology work, because the new site is located in an archaeological significant area next to castles and park, and risk contingencies. Risk contingencies that had to be applied early in the project to allow for these kinds of changes. So Donald Dewar originally provided new costs, and they had gone from 180 to 346 million. It was in 1999. In April 2000, they had to jump it again to $612 million. And so the cost projection increases came about. Actually, in my research, I was that kind of research at that point. There was no real understanding other than it went from this to this, and I had to think it was probably the process of how they chose to procure the building contract that they were probably designing really sophisticated work and working everything out on the fly, going out to tender with incomplete documents and trying to work things out as the project was under construction. That's the only thing I can think of why it would jump like that. So this is April 2000. At that point, Vidales was quite ill, and he passed away, which was a huge impact on the leadership of the project. Massive impact, so his firm took over. His wife, Benedita, took over the project and completed the project. In November 2001, the project had to be increased again to $867 million from $612 million. This is like every 12 months almost. And this is a small country. I mean, Scotland's not a big country; it's a small country. This is a huge impact on. This means schools don't get built. This means hospitals don't get built. Because money has to come from someplace. So it means all kinds of things don't happen because all of a sudden you have this kind of storm, which is what was happening. There was a storm taking place. And it was like, so rising costs were blamed on construction problems attempting to complete from May 2003, which is, I think, there was the UK government was changing at that point. So this was November 2001, $867 million. December 2002 went up to $894 million. And the plans to reopen ceremony are shelved because they realized that it's not going to happen. Increased security requirements as a result of 9/11. Hidden extras in the construction process and ongoing delays continue to raise costs. September 2003, it's over $1 billion. Consulting fees are talking $150 million. So it's a scandal. It's been a scandal actually in Scotland. It still is actually. It was a scandal in Scotland by the time it was here, because it had gone from like 135, it's even 180 million, to this, to $1.1 billion. And that they continue to have problems with the project. In February 2004, it kind of capped out at $1.2 billion, and they finally opened in December. Costs have increased again due to further problems with construction, and then they put the building back to 2005, but they realized that they could open it in December. In October 2005. So, anyway, let's go on. But to me, cost management is what we're talking about today. There's like a big, dramatic kind of picture of cost management. But what followed after this was actually quite interesting. So the final costs actually dropped by $50 million. So by the time Scottish Parliament opened, the number was $1.18 billion, which is kind of, I think, increased tenfold since they started the project. And this was sort of final results. I mean, it's sort of some of the images of the building. It's worth. I mean, I think it's worthwhile visiting. These are some of the kind of different elements of it. real sense of Macintosh in here someplace. But this happened, called the Hollywood Inquiry. And this is where, so this, at this time, which was 2004, we were working on the Canadian War Museum. The Canadian War Museum had this kind of incredible pressure on it not to be over budget and not to be behind schedule, because the Museum of Civilization had come in way over budget, got way behind schedule, and so Canadian War Museum was the first museum that they had commissioned since that time. So they had brought in some very kind of heavy project managers who were like super strict, and the obsession with cost was an obsession from day one. But this was where some of the parliamentary civil servants were going to kind of follow up on this Hollywood Inquiry, because this kind of thing sends a chill to anybody, public servants in particular, this kind of complete kind of, so, you know, what happened was the costs just, obviously it doesn't, you know, obviously everything was so chaotic that they're just the only thing they could do was just to keep throwing money at it and hope that it would get finished within a reasonable amount. So there was a gentleman named Lord Fraser who did this year-long inquiry. It was on BBC. You can see it actually, you can see it on YouTube, some of the different kind of outcomes of it. But but the interesting thing, again, coming back to cost management, in the summary, he talks about that relatively early stages, a number of decisions that were taken were fundamentally wrong or wholly misleading. And this is why it's important to get it right at the start and to spend the time, spend the time trying to get it right. That it's a consequence of those decisions which have caused a massive increase in costs of buildings. Obviously, and then there was this issue about Morales not paying much attention to the economy of the project, but I don't think that was a fair shot at Morales. But here's some of the things that really Lord Fraser actually just thought was so the lessons learned. That political decisions were rushed, and that this turned out to be a crucial. This Hollywood site was chosen later with only a cursory assessment of the site. Designer was picked rather than design because it was a quicker option. The method of building the Parliament, again, it's the construction methodology, procurement. The method of building was selected to allow work to start before the design was drawn up. That's a very complicated design. Very complicated design. There's a lot of detail on that. All of these decisions backfired. This is right from the report. I'm just kind of lifting documents out of this, being quotes out of the report. The site was too small. Proper design was delivered years later than was planned. And the construction management method allowed for the prices to soar. The thing about construction management, I think we talked about it earlier, the CCDC 5B. Clients oftentimes, when you recommend to a client what method they use to select, this is the thing that happens. You have to, some of them, they need to know what the number is before the contractor starts to scrape the ground. So that means you want to recommend the stipulated sum of contract, or you want to recommend design build. Construction management is a really tough one, because in that one you never know what the price is, oftentimes until it's way too late to influence it. Politicians' role in the process. So there's another aspect here, it's the role of the politicians' role in the process. In his words, they made a mess out of it. The main reason was they tried to design and build a parliament by committee. Once the project started to fall apart, once the prices started to go up, and this is like back when it was like maybe $300 million, and they thought, then it was a scandal. Go right down from 180 to 300. They created a committee of parliamentarians, and they all started to manage the job. So they weren't experts, they were politicians. They were elected politicians. And they had to deal with the competing demands for members for more space, which they gave them, which were change orders. There were those who didn't even want to see the project built, a number of politicians, so they worked against the committee. And those who didn't like the idea that somebody was telling them what to do. So there was a dysfunctional political committee. So they realized after a while that this committee wasn't working. So they said, let's make another committee. And so after a year of mix-ups, they created another committee called the Hollywood Progress Group. So now there's two committees actually managing the project. Two different groups trying to direct civil servants, who were in turn trying to direct construction managers and architects. The architects were operating from two different cities, and the relationship with the architects was also, I mean, I can't imagine the stress between those three firms trying to make this thing work. I just can't imagine. Civil servants also, who were under the politicians, deliberately withheld vital cost information before a crucial 1999 vote, because they realized, so what was it back in 1999? 1999, it went back to Parliament for a vote, because they were kind of saying, ooh, it's getting a little out of control. 1999 was 246 million. So apparently what they did was they took the costs and they just put them in a drawer, and they said everything was going fine. And so Parliament elected to proceed, because they realized that Parliament probably would have killed the job at that point. It probably would have killed it. There would have been enough kind of pressure on it to stop it. So whether that was the right thing or wrong thing, it was not the right thing not to advise their political masters. They did not pass on official estimates to cost consultants that the price was already spiraling out of control, that influenced the will of the Parliament. All this was being done for, I mean, everybody had the right intentions. Everyone had the right intentions, but it wasn't kind of working. Civil servants had key management posts despite a lack of construction experience. They didn't understand construction management, they didn't understand how architects think, they didn't understand how engineers think, and yet they were in charge. There was a rotating door. So again, there was a rotating doors of actually leaders in the field that were leading the project. And any time that there was a dispute with a civil servant or politician, those individuals were pushed off the block. So that, the kind of rotating doors in leadership also created a kind of a vacuum in terms of who was in charge of the job. Morales died in 2000. Donald Dewar, who was really the patron, the guy who was the first minister of Scotland, he died like 2 or 3 months later. He fell and brain hemorrhage. Both of them died from brain tumors. And they were very tight, very close. So they were the two kind of visionaries that got lost. The next individual retired and kind of left. Another individual left. All the top people kind of left the job. The original project manager resigned after a few months because he had a sense that it was a ship that was, his last words were it was going to be a disaster. The other individual, the next one took over, Alan Izzy, walked out after failing to get support for cost cutting. And then Sarah Davidson, who was the final one, walked out before the end of the project as well. This is all within a 4-year period. That's really tight. There's all these people being lost in a 4-year period. That's the leadership, the continuity, and the vision for the project. Communication between the architects broke down to such an extent that they were almost fired from the project. They had to have architectural experts come in and kind of help these firms kind of communicate with one another. Our MGM, I think, actually went bankrupt soon after this. Bovis, who was the construction manager, won the construction management contract despite being dropped from the short list of bidders. They won. So I think probably politics for submitting they were dropped because they submitted too high a tender. Morales was given the contract to design the Parliament without having appropriate insurance. I think Tom earlier talked about having insurance. Like the insurance on this project would have been $10 or $15 million per claim for sure. Just to have that insurance, probably more. Parliament paid out millions of pounds to a company with a track record of selling with bust. I think that was RMGM. I'm pretty sure. It was a very distinguished Scottish firm, multi-generational firm, and it just went under. And then finally, this was an article that I picked up recently, cheaper to tear down the building by 2020. They're still spending money on it. So this is from the Scotsman. This is 2014. So I wanted to show this as a kind of, I've always been intrigued by this project the more I read about it, because it talks to the principles of cost management, the way it talks about honesty, proper pre-planning, proper knowledge. I think it would say the Canadian Science and Tech Museum, I think why are we getting these estimates that in a way per square footage that aren't correct? mean, this is how these these are the circumstances that create this kind of environment where these kinds of situations can take place. I wanted to show you another study. Again, I'm often engaged in projects on costing, and I work with a lot of cost consultants, and they're very technical in terms of approaching these jobs. So there are tools we'll look at later on. But this is a study from the University of Chicago. It was put out just a little while ago, set in stone. It's a really great study. It's online. Anyway, they looked at 700 projects built between 1994 and 2008, with budgets between $4 million and $355 million. This is like recently. So 80% of those projects are over budget. They're over budget. On an average of 62%, some as much as 200%. So this is not just, this is like, to me, it's like, why is this happening? Why is there so much that we can't control in a project that they get so much out of hand? So the University of Chicago study is a really great study because the consequences of these things, oftentimes some of these cultural institutions can't sustain themselves, they go bankrupt. Particularly in the US where they have to get bonding, they have to sort of raise the funds for it. So this kind of, I don't know if it's management or what, you get out of the gate with the wrong information. Oftentimes what you're thinking is that you're coming out of the gate with the wrong information. And that oftentimes that information is low because the people that need to get the approvals to let it go out can't give the right information to let it go out because they won't get the approvals for it. So, for example, if I look at science and tech and I say, here's a 535,000 square foot museum, I'd say, it's not 117 million, it's probably closer to double that. But this is what we have. Somehow somebody's going to prove that, and all architectural firms are probably going to chase it and try and get it on the basis that at some point the right number will drop and that the government will fund it accordingly. So this is another book I just started reading called Broken Buildings, Busted Budgets. Just because I've been kind of interested in, I'm really interested as an individual as much as sort of practically about schedules and costs, like why we as architects are given this task of trying to address the issues of schedules and costs. And I'll show you why we're asked to address that. Yes?
Do you think?
But this is very true. Every now and then, a major construction project is completed, and everyone's amazed that it's actually on time.
Do you think that if these like big public projects like that, if it started out with a more reasonable number, would be more likely that it would reach budget? Because
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Because oftentimes, the point I'm trying to make is that, and the issue about cost management as opposed to cost control, it's really the foundations are the decisions that you make around cost and schedule and procurement. Those three components.
At the start. And
it's being realistic. I'm saying realistic, but I also understand why it doesn't work. Why there's this desire to be totally optimistic and say, okay, let's just make it this and cross our fingers, like the civil servants not letting Parliament know that actually, like, everything's spiraling out of control. So there's this other side that wants to see these things built. So they're very optimistic about what it takes to accomplish. I think the ROM's a classic example. I think the ROM started off as that little thing. It's almost $250 million, that piece. And I think it was, I don't know, maybe a third of that at one point. That was just, but that allowed it to get going. I don't know. But the thing is, when you're engaged in that kind of work, reputations are destroyed. I mean, if you look at the Scottish Parliament, reputations were just destroyed. The country's saddled with this enormous debt that continues. I mean, and they have this building that's won a lot of awards, but it's also today still controversial in terms of the amount that it takes to kind of keep it afloat. So, and you just wonder why, if the conditions, if they'd approached it a bit differently, that might not be the building that was there. Morales may have designed it, but it might not be the same building. It might be a different type of building. And then I think the University of Chicago study set in stone just to look at the numbers of how these projects get out of control and the significance of them. The fact that there's so many, in my mind, means that there's just an epidemic of or either we just don't know how to control costs, or there's like this delusion that's happening that we can actually control costs on projects. So as architects, why should we care? We have to care because our agreements say that we have to care. These are the 3 documents that we use. There's document 6, document 9 that we sign with our consultants, so they have to care. Because our contract supersedes their contract. There's a document 600 by the OEA. And, I just thought, I'm not going to go into it, but I just thought I would show you some of the kind of, if you look at the agreement, there's a date client, this is a part of the film construction budget. Here you have client, the architect. It's really simple for the following construction budget. So we have to agree that that budget is the budget for the project. This is the start, this is before anybody's on board, before the builders are on board, and the construction contract is. And there's what the definition of the budget is. Client's combined estimate of the construction cost and construction contingencies, or if there's no amount of budget, amount agreed to by the client. This is the kind of contract that Morales would have had to sign in RJM as a joint venture. This is what you would have had to say, like, we'll agree to $180 million. And this is what they would be held to. So because construction cost, as opposed to the construction budget, is the contract prices of all project elements designed or specified on behalf as a result of the coordination, our coordination, including cash allowances, building permits, changes, construction management fees, other fees, the coordination, procurement of construction services, and all applicable taxes. So it goes on to say that where there's no contract price, the construction cost should be the statement of probable cost as determined by the architect. So we're the architects. So we're determining the budget in some cases. Or is agreed to by the architect, and the cost consultant is engaged at market rate, so we have to agree to the cost consultant as well. So we're kind of party to this process. Construction costs excludes art fees, other professional fees, and land costs and land development damages. So if we go to the general conditions of our agreement, which outlines the services that we have to provide. One thing we have to do in the process of executing our services is we have to provide cost estimates. So we need to have quantity surveyors or cost consultants working with us to provide cost estimates at different phases of our work. So these are the different phases of our contractual agreement, which would be schematic, design, construction, procurement. And so if we provide these estimates, and if our estimates are over, there's conditions that direct how the client reacts to that. So if our bids are over, exceeds the latest approved construction cost estimates, we have to, the client has to authorize rebidding and renegotiating of the proposal. If the lowest bid exceeds the construction costs, this is when the project is up for tender. Cooperate with the architect in revising the project scope quality as necessary to reduce the construction cost. At its discretion, terminate the agreement, our agreement, in accordance with paragraph 5.6.3. So that's in our contract, in our agreement. If the client chooses to proceed, this is also in our agreement, unless the excess is due to extraordinary market conditions, the architect at no additional fee shall modify the construction documents or provide other services necessary to reduce the construction cost. So that's why we have to care about costs. That's why we have to care about why it's right coming out of the gate, and that we're not getting engaged in a project that really can't ever meet the construction costs, because the client's expectations are that they want a $60 million project for $30 million. And I know that this is so anyway. I can take examples in the city of Toronto where firms, well-known firms, have to go back and take their contract documents, redraw their contract documents, and put them up for tender and rebid all at no cost, because the budget was exceeded by, oftentimes there's a percentage in here, it's generally 15%. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's 0%. We did one contract, also with a well-known client, where it's 0%, and we actually got nailed. We got nailed. We just got nailed to the wall. We never thought we would actually be over budget, but we were over budget with the construction manager. So we ended up putting in 4 or 5 months of just redrawing and bringing things down to make it work. So this is, so the budget is a very, very serious responsibility. In the sense, the responsibility we have to agree to it. We have responsibilities for it in terms of monitoring it and ensuring that the client gets their project for the budget that we have agreed to. So the irony is that it's a $60 million project, and we agree with the client that it's $30 million. We're being optimistic at the same time. So there's that kind of, again, it's the cost management coming out of the gate. I think is really important. Maybe the honesty. We have this desire to please clients. We have a desire not to piss them off. We really want to work with them. So to actually come to them and say, you know what? I think we're like way off the mark. It's a way that we have to learn to communicate that kind of information. So
One question.
Sure.
Sorry, just with what you were just saying, how does an architect go about that beginning of a project, and exactly at what stage do you kind of come up and say, we don't?
So what we like to do in a project is what we will do is we will ask for a budget estimate right after we're awarded the project. So if we're awarded a project and there's we have enough information, we will ask that we will initiate an elemental cost analysis and look at all the pieces, and then we'll have a good understanding with good confidence. And that's the best time to address the client too. Best time to address it when you actually have them. You have the contract signed and theirs, and you can tell them, that this is the way it has to be. You can say, look, the estimates don't add up. So, and the other thing that is really, we're going to talk a bit about value engineering, which is another cost management tool. Value engineering, which is really a form of kind of cost cutting and replacing things with other elements. But the value engineering works best early on in the project. And the value engineering works best when you're actually reducing areas. That's the only way you're actually going to save significant amounts of money on a project. Often clients think that, these materials and finishes and everything are the ones. But whenever you're working and if your job's over budget, oftentimes you come back and strip this, strip that. So woods are taken out or stones taken out and drywall appears everywhere, or whatever. And it always seems to be materials. But it's oftentimes your best advice to a client is to say you have to reduce area, because that's where you get the full benefit of cost savings. Because you're reducing mechanical, you're reducing electrical, you're reducing everything throughout the project, and so that's your best way of actually bringing it down. Yes.
So just to be clear, once the contract between the architect and the owner is signed, then
The agreement.
The agreement. My bad. Then you go out to hire a cost consultant who...
Yeah, actually, if we're into the project, that's what we recommend when we interview. If we have concerns about the budget, we'll tell them we have concerns. And then we'll also say what we would like to do is do an estimate once we're
without a design, just like a cost consultant.
Well, if you have a square foot, if you know the area,
right.
And there's a building type,
right.
and you can do an elemental area cost takeoff just on the basis of that, and you can get a good sense. You can get some of these cost consultants. You have these big databases, you have current costs, and you can actually provide. You can provide it sort of to within that project complexity. So this chart kind of shows the different types of cost estimates that we would be engaged in a typical job. That would be the type of cost estimate that we would be asking for from our cost consultants. And one is a kind of a concept sketch design, which has that kind of level of variance depending on the complexity of the project. And then that changes as it goes through to 100% complete tender for your final cost estimate. And that's the different kind of relationship to our phase of work that So I'll just go through the cost estimates just to kind of talk about what they are. Assessment based on the initial functional program, class B cost estimate, and kind of a broad concept approach. So the site and the program have been approved, and the owner may guess. So this, if we think back to, say, the apartment buildings or something, I probably took a pretty good guess. The budget available trigger, which made legal due to lack of update cost advice. So after initial design concepts, prepare an order of magnitude estimate, and you get a rough cost per square meter. And so it allows you to verify the order of magnitude. So sometimes we'll do that even before we have it. If we're really concerned about the budget, we'll do that before we actually do that. So we'll do like a pre-class B if we're really concerned. The actual assessment is 20 to 30%, depending on the complexity. So if it's like a warehouse, probably you're really good. If it's a more complicated project, then you have to add a greater variance. You add design and pricing allowances for unknown risks. You allow for inflation. You allow for the length of time working on document production, as well as the duration of construction. All of these are allowed for in the course of the pricing. These are the kinds of things that should be included in estimates. Of course, there's the design costs, there's the pricing costs, bid, construction, escalation, and scope. These are all contingencies. And these estimates usually can form the basis of the agreement between ourselves and the owner. Class C cost estimates. So this is when you really have a schematic design, where the program is set and confirmed. So you provided plans, elevations, sections, and a palette of materials. A lot of form and space, and then the design is completed up to 33%. So all the major elements are assessed and measured and priced at rates considered competitive for that particular project. Under stipulated, in this case, it's stipulated lump sum form. So the estimate is based on fair market conditions, and the project is value of the construction project is not a prediction of the low bid. The low bid is like a different. That's like a market value for that. So this is where you have to really understand the exclusions. I have a list of exclusions. We'll go through them. I'll just go review the list of exclusions and identify the cost considerations for the cost estimate. So we'll take a look at some of those. There's a Class B cost estimate. This is really when you're in construction documents based on working drawings and more detailed dimensionings from generated drawings. And you have all of your systems, your mechanical, electrical, IT, AV, acoustic, everything. Element sizes, you have dimensions, and all the outline specs of all the systems are available. So this is where you're really looking at the project at different phases, 50%, 60%, or 95%. That's when you can ask for that type of estimate, either 50, 66, or 95%. So we would tend to ask it more towards 66%. Class A is really sort of a pre-tender estimate. This is the type of estimate you would do just before you go for tender. It's 100%, everything is complete, and you have to allow a bit of time for that to take place. We often ask so we just had a project that we put out recently. We asked that the cost consultant do a trade takeoff. They generally don't do trade takeoffs, they do elemental, they do components. The way they measure the building in components and pieces and they cost it. But at the final estimate, we asked the cost consultant to do a trade takeoff the same way a builder would do a takeoff. So a builder will do a takeoff, they'll measure the materials, they'll do the trades will measure the materials, and they'll put hours to it. Those are the two components that will create the basis of the cost. They'll measure the materials that they're going to have to buy and install. They're going to put hours into the work that they're going to put together, and they'll put their profit markup on that, and that's their cost. And that's the way we ask for our last cost to be done. So that if there's a discrepancy between our cost and the low bid cost, we can compare apples to apples. One of the things that we discovered when we were caught on that 0% override, we had a cost estimate that was done as elemental. Everything was done in components. And when we tried to compare it to the contractor's bids, we couldn't compare them. because they weren't the same way of taking off and measuring a project. So it's very important towards the end of the job to align the costing process with how the builder is going to take off and quantify and cost their portion of the work. So this is the final estimate for tender. Value engineering. This is just sort of a process that we'll talk about. But here's the construction estimate. So here's some of the following that are generally excluded from the cost estimate. A lot of exclusions. So it excludes GST, land, project management fees, furniture. This sometimes clients react with surprise when they see this. They think everything's in. Yes?
So how much of an add-on is that? You gave $100 million construction, is that another $60 million?
It can be, yeah, it can be, you know, your fees, soft costs. Soft costs can easily be, you can add another 20-30% project for sure. These all would be considered soft costs. So, yeah, it can be, or more even. So, which is always a shock for some clients. But,
Sorry, do you have a percentage that you usually use? Do you give the owner an idea of?
yeah, we always try and go high because if that's go high.
Yeah.
Owners always remember a low price. Always remember to say, well, come on, what's it worth? What's it worth? Tell me what you can build it for. They'll remember that. So try not. So we always try and give a reasonable number. So we try and say at least 30%, 25, 30%. I mean, you won't be wrong that number. So because you know, any land costs, I mean, that could be huge. And your project management fees, your consultants' fees. Consultant fees alone can be 10%, 12%. I mean, you could be way more than 30% with some of these. You have legal fees, administrations, permits can cost a fortune, depending on the project. Surveys, inspection and testing, moving costs, escalation contingencies, demolition.
Why wouldn't the contractor price demolition?
Would they price? No, this is an estimator pricing. Contractor. If there's demolition, they'll this project probably will be demolition.
The equipment, if the function of a building is based on, for example, school
Yeah.
or like a performance space, you don't include that at all?
No, actually, oftentimes the audiovisual consultants actually say don't carry those as costs. You can actually, if they're bid later in the project, and you carry a separate allowance for them, they actually might get them for a better value than carrying them and costing them now. So typically, what you would do is you would provide all the conduit for everything, so you just have empty conduit. And so a mechanic would ask the cost consultant to carry the numbers to the empty conduit, and the builder would carry the numbers for it as well. So that's one of those things that seems to be always carried by the owner.
But sometimes because it's tied to the square footage,
Yep.
how do you avoid losing that?
Well, you can do a number for that too. So for example, when we were looking at the Science and Tech Museum, we just worked out a number of what you would pay for storage systems at so many dollars per square foot. And I think it's probably not too wrong. Just you can work it out based on square footage and having a kind of a number of what you might use for AD, and then you'll have a pretty good idea of what you would need to carry. So anyway, this is more kind of, it's important, whatever the exclusions are, to be different for different projects. It's important that we review the exclusions with the owner, so they're not surprised later on. This is kind of a typical, this is actually sort of a typical, kind of a cost consultant will break up their cost estimate. It's this kind of format of the shell, the interiors, services, site work. They give you a net building cost. Here it's 68 million. And then you have a total construction estimate by adding in fees and everything. They add in design allowances. In some cases, they don't add design allowances. Oftentimes, you'll have a discussion with the client how you want to handle the allowances. And then they'll come up with a total number at the end of the project, at the end of the cost estimate. And this is the kind of cost check that you can use as the project proceeds. And so the exercise of value engineering, and so this is sort of the front sheet. This is sort of the front sheet of your cost estimate. And then your back sheets are just full of this kind of information of the, elevator pits. It's just kind of more detailed information. What we try to do with these is go through every line of this with the cost consultant to find out. Oftentimes, you'll find that you can just have savings that they might not have got some of the measurements correct, the quantities correct. So we actually spend a fair bit of time with the cost consultant after they've done a report. We actually insist that we see it before we send anything on to the consultant, so we have a chance to review it, so we understand it. And then we can go through with the owner. So here's the value engineering chart. This is where the cost saving exercises. So the cost saving exercises really work best up here in this phase of the work. And you can see as you get into construction documents and this end of the project that the gains that you get from value engineering are cost cutting are reduced dramatically. And the reason why is that once you're in construction, you've already signed a contract, so you're actually trying to save costs while you're building. So oftentimes you have to pay a restocking fee. Oftentimes you won't get a full value, you won't get a full credit dollar on dollar, and then you'll be hit with an increased cost for something else to go in. So cost savings through this portion of the work and through working drawings, you don't get the full benefit of value engineering cost management. So this is really the area where you need to kind of focus if you want to really get the major savings. And these are the times when you can actually impact the design. And this comes back to cost management. And back to the very first image that we had about in the concept stage is really when you have the most effective means of establishing the cost and setting the guidelines and the parameters for the costing of the project throughout the course of the job. That's it. That's it. I don't know
Any additional questions that anybody has?
I have a question on the value engineering. Do you have like a minimum value of a project that you would actually employ that cost consultant, or?
Oh, for a cost consultant?
Yeah. Because I'm thinking of smaller projects where, based on the experience of the architect, they may not need to employ it.
I think that probably. So, well, for us, even if it's like a $5 or $6 million project, we would have some level of costing. We may not have as many cost checks. Obviously, the bigger the project, the kind of procurement method that we use, oftentimes, if you're at greater risk for costs getting out of control, we would try and ensure that there's more cost checking. So we would ask the cost consultant to kind of increase their scope of services during certain course of that. So I think for that school, for example, we had a cost consultant work with us on that.
And is it required by some kind of like?
Well, we're required by contract to keep the job on budget.
Okay.
So if we ignore that part of our responsibility, well, it's just, you can't ignore that responsibility. So you need to find a way to control the cost. So if we ourselves are really good at it, which we're not, then what we would do is hire a cost consultant, a quantity surveyor, and they're the ones that have the knowledge, they have the current knowledge, they're kind of keeping up. The big thing for us, say, with this Windsor project was we were obsessing over the Canadian dollar was against the American dollar, and so many of our products come from the U.S. We were just obsessing about what impact that would have on the costs. Even though the costs are being maintained, there could be a huge spike in terms of materials now, because you have to pay more for materials coming from the south. So you do need cost consultants for at least the way we feel we need to work with the client, and also need to protect ourselves too. That's good. And so we would. I would think even on a house, because we have done some houses where they've been. You do need to have some measure of control of costing. And it's a good exercise in many ways, and clients understand it, and I think that's, and it's oftentimes better to have a third party do it rather than us, because they might say, well, you're biased, or whatever. Oftentimes, if it goes up, they feel that we're going to get additional fees, so therefore are interested in seeing the project go up. Things like that. So if you have a third party doing it, you don't have to deal with that. You can just deal with the professionalism of the cost management portion of it. So, yes?
And if the agreement between the owner and the architect is signed with a cost of project
Yes.
in there, and you're using Class D estimate.
Yeah,
correct?
so let's say the first estimate, yeah.
But that estimate doesn't happen until some sort of schematic design is ready. So does that agreement get signed only?
No, actually, we typically would like to sign the agreement beforehand.
Okay.
And sometimes some clients won't sign an agreement until they get. Sometimes we may not sign an agreement until we're well into a project. The client, wants to. Every client is different about how they want to kind of make an agreement with you. Some want to do it right away. Some actually wait and see. So we always try and get the agreement done as fast, as quickly as we can. Some clients we defer it until they get a good sense of what the numbers are going to be for the project.
But if you complete the schematic design that goes in for a cost estimate, and the client just doesn't like the price, essentially, they can just walk away from it.
Yeah, they can. Well, it says they can
and
fire
you
them.
get paid. So
Yeah, no, I know. I'm talking. There's a well-known architectural firm that had to return all their fees, I think, at the end of the project because it was so out of control. This Canadian firm, they returned everything. It was a house, and it's kind of famous. Well, it's kind of. I mean, it went to court, obviously, and consumed the owner's time. Maybe the owner's dropped out and sick. Obviously, the architects took a damage, and then at the end, the judge said, "Oh, we've got to get back all the fees that you realized on this project." So it was a very, very well known group. So because they were responsible, at the end of the day, like it's fascinating. At the end of the day, when somebody looks in the rearview mirror at how we work, they'll go to that document and they'll say, "Look, here's what it said. Here's what it said. Here's what you agreed to do. You agreed to it. You're the professional. You agreed to it." So that's why the cost management portion is so significant in the work we do, and that to have a true understanding of that and have our clients understand it, and how we can manage the job in terms of the costing that goes forward is very, it's a significant portion of how we approach the design, how we develop the design, and the type of design work that we do. So obviously, if we have, say, $150 square foot, and we had a budget of $4 or $5 million, we would adjust the way we approach the design, as opposed to a much bigger number, more complex type of job, things like that. So that's another aspect of cost management is our actual approach to how we approach the design. It's all based on kind of first principles almost.
And the consultant's fees, like the architect's fees, are tied to that Class D estimate as well, or?
Well, the consultant fees. So here we'll talk about consultant fees. If you can get whatever fees you want, get whatever fees you want. Seriously, I would say if you can negotiate fees, negotiate the best possibly you think that you can. Sometimes you can do it without connecting it to the percentage. Sometimes you can do it on the basis of services or whatever. So, no, your consultant fees, they may be connected to it, but oftentimes they're not these days. They're kind of depending on the client. It's a public body. They're actually looking for low fees. I think Carol on that, but most public bodies are looking for municipalities look for low fees. So oftentimes there's no relation to the value of the job at all. So and again that's a business decision. It's a business decision. I mean we have this conversation often. That's a business decision that firms have to make whether they want to do that or not. It's like a whole other discussion on fees, how we calculate fees. I mean I think it's important I'll go off on fees, because I've actually lectured a bit on fees. Because, you know, it's important to understand that when you charge money for a project, how that fee is utilized in the firm, how it's dispersed into the firm, how the overhead works, where the numbers go, you know. It's really, it's once you have that understanding, it's a much better sense of what you need to charge, but oftentimes, because it's such a competitive environment, and Ontario is a very ferociously competitive environment, you take a gamble, you take a risk, you know, you take a risk that you might need the project, you know, you want the project, great project, so, and that you will work with the client and come to some understanding at the end of the day. So you'll settle for a fee, and sometimes it's not, has nothing to do with the actual value of the job.
And if, let's say there's change orders that, you know, any day overdue, the contractor gets paid, are there adjustments of fees for
No.
architects? No?
Well, it depends.
What about
Okay, sometimes there
design?
is, sometimes there is. So what happens with a lot of clients, so I'll tell you what I feel in the last 4 or 5 years, because it's such a competitive environment, both on the builder side and on the consultant side, that it's a very competitive. So contractors are you know, they are very meticulous about change orders, very meticulous about changes to schedule, and they're very aggressive about going after money after the job is finished. You can get a contractor's third-party claim a year or two after a project because they've worked their numbers and they realize that they've lost money, or they've tried to negotiate a deal with the client, and because that's their primary contact, but they can third-party claim against the consultants. And I think that's becoming more common, and they do that because we, as architects, carry air and emissions insurance with our indemnity plan. So that's a pot of money. It's a very business-based decision, but they identify certain things that were not done well, or there was delays in the schedule attributed to our work, or there was, you know, mismanagement attributed to our work, and that'll be the basis on which they'll make a claim. And consultants, on the other hand, oftentimes will go back and ask for additional fees. If you say, for example, for example, on the construction management contract, definitely you need additional fees if you're doing construction management. You need additional fees beyond the fees that you would charge based on the OAR rate. So, and the reason you need additional fees is because you are doing so many more tenders. You know, you're doing so many more drawings. You have, and you need people to actually do all that work. It just can't be done by 1 or 2 people. If you have, you know, for example, 15 or 10 or 12 different tender packages, you need people to do them. You need people to put them out. And you also need people to continue carrying on with the contract documents. And then you have people administering the project. So you need more fees. That's beyond the stipulated sum project. So all of that work is done before the job gets to begin construction. So yeah, so construction management, the architects would require more fees. Design build, I think, is the most difficult. It's the most difficult relationship, I think, where we have a builder for our client. That's a tough one, because oftentimes the builder will turn and sue the architect, because in a way you become like a trade. You're not a trade source. But you also, you have this pot of money, which is like your insurance, so they'll go after them. So I think that's the kind of change that's happening in the industry. I don't know if it's the Americanization of how we do business, but so I think it's important that when we, you know, all this information that we learn in the class here, is it's really about understanding how we can best service the work that we do the best work that we can, and kind of be really kind of intelligent and streetwise about how we need to document, how we need to manage, how we need to kind of communicate, how we need to be kind of really you know, upfront and honest, and because sometimes we can bend it a bit because we want to please clients. We don't want to get into the conflict of any kind. So it was really, I think maybe, you know, the Scottish Parliament for me was kind of constructive in that it was really didn't have a lot to do with the consultants in a way. It had a lot to do with how it was actually managed and developed from the client side. So, any more questions? Anyway, I have to say, I think you're really a great group. I was listening to some of the questions this morning. I don't think I could have answered a lot of those questions that you're asking with zoning. So I was quite intrigued by Tom was trying to answer some of them. Anyway, thanks very much for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards if you like. But yeah, so that's it. You can go home now. You can go.
So there's the matter of the. Let me just terminate the recording.